I went camping alone in the fall of 2016, a few weeks after my 28th birthday. I picked a small state forest in the northern part of Pennsylvania, not one of the popular parks, but a place with old logging roads and no marked campsites. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be far from people. I told myself I knew what I was doing because I had camped many times before. That confidence is what almost got me hurt. The weather report said light rain, nothing serious. By the time I parked my truck at the end of the gravel road, the sky was already darker than it should have been at that hour. Thick clouds pressed low over the trees, and the air felt heavy and wet. The smell of damp leaves and soil filled my nose as soon as I stepped out. I loaded my pack, locked the truck, and started walking down an old trail that barely looked used anymore. The ground was soft, and my boots left deep prints in the mud. About an hour in, the rain started for real. It was not a storm yet, just steady rain that soaked through everything slowly. The trees blocked some of it, but water still dripped down my neck and into my sleeves. I kept going because I had already committed. Turning back felt like quitting, and that kind of thinking followed me deep into the woods. I found a flat spot near a shallow creek and decided to set up there. The creek was swollen from recent rain and made a constant rushing sound. First, I liked that sound. It felt natural and calming. I set up my tent on slightly higher ground, tied a tarp between two trees, and tried to keep my gear dry. Everything took longer because my hands were cold and slippery. The rain kept getting heavier, tapping on the tarp and leaves above me. By the time I finished, it was almost dark. The forest changed when the light faded. Shapes blurred together, and the trees felt closer. The rain turned the ground shiny and black. I ate a simple meal and sat under the tarp, listening to the water and the wind moving through the branches. That was when I noticed something felt off. It was not fear yet, just a feeling that I was not as alone as I had been an hour earlier. The sounds around me changed. The usual night noises like insects and distant animals were gone. All I could hear was rain and the creek. I told myself it was normal that animals go quiet sometimes. Still, I kept looking into the trees. The beam from my headlamp showed wet trunks and shining leaves, but nothing else. Later that night, the rain turned into a hard downpour. Wind pushed it sideways and the tarp snapped and strained against the rope. I moved into my tent and zipped it up tight. Water pooled outside, and I could feel the cold seeping through the ground. The creek sounded louder now, closer, like it was rising. I lay there trying to sleep, counting breaths, listening. That was when I heard footsteps. They were not loud, just slow, careful steps on wet leaves. First, I thought it was a deer. Then I noticed the pattern. Too steady, too slow. The steps stopped, then started again. They circled the area, never getting too close, never moving away. I held my breath without meaning to. My heart beat hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I did not move. I did not turn on my light. I listened. The steps came closer. The rain made everything harder to hear, but I could tell the sound was upright, not four legs. Whoever it was moved with weight, shifting carefully, like they were trying not to slip. The footsteps paused near my tarp. I could hear breathing now, faint but real, carried by the damp air. I told myself it had to be another camper. That thought did not help. There were no trails nearby that led to this spot, no signs of anyone else, and no reason for someone to be wandering around my camp in the rain, in the dark, without a light. The tent fabric moved slightly, pushed by the wind or something else. Water dripped from the trees in slow, heavy drops. The footsteps moved again, stopping just outside the tent. I stared at the thin wall of nylon between me and whatever was out there. I could see a darker shape against the lighter rain-wet fabric, tall and still. Minutes passed. My legs cramped from staying still. The shape shifted once, just enough to tell me it was a person. No animal stands that way, No animal waits like that. Eventually, the shape moved away. The steps faded into the rain. I stayed frozen long after the sound was gone. I did not sleep. I just lay there, listening, every nerve tight, waiting for the sound to come back. Sometime after midnight, the creek overflowed. Water rushed closer, creeping toward my tent. The ground beneath me turned soft and uneven. That forced me to move. I packed what I could as quietly as possible, stuffing wet gear into my bag. My hands shook and I dropped things more than once. Each small sound felt too loud. When I stepped out of the tent, the rain hit me like a wall. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the dark. The creek was only a few feet away now, brown water rushing fast. I could not stay there. I slung my pack on and started uphill, away from the water, away from the camp. That was when I saw footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the mud around my campsite. Boot prints, not mine. They led around the tent, circled it more than once, and then followed the same direction I was going. Whoever had been there had already walked this path. The fear turned cold and sharp. I kept moving, slipping on wet leaves, breathing hard. The rain soaked me completely. My light bounced wildly as I climbed, making shadows jump and twist. Every sound behind me felt close, even when it was just water dripping from branches. I reached an old logging road after what felt like hours. The open space felt safer, even though it meant being exposed. I followed it downhill, knowing it would eventually lead back to the main road. The rain never stopped. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached under the weight of the pack. At one point, I heard footsteps again behind me on the road. Slow, measured, matching my pace. I did not look back. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other. My breath came in short bursts, fogging the air in front of me. The sound stayed with me for a long time, then slowly faded. I did not know if the person stopped or turned away. I did not stop walking until I saw the faint shape of my truck through the trees. When I reached it, my hands fumbled with the keys. I climbed inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there shaking, soaked, staring into the dark forest through the windshield. The rain washed over the glass in heavy sheets. Nothing moved. I waited for a long time before starting the engine. The drive out felt endless. When I reached the highway, the lights and pavement felt unreal, like I had stepped into another world. I never went back to that forest. I reported the footprints to a ranger later that week, but there was nothing they could do without more information. No one was found. No explanation was given. What stays with me is not the fear I felt in the moment, but the certainty of it. Someone was there that night. Someone watched me alone in the rain and chose not to be seen. I learned that the woods do not need anything unreal to be terrifying. All it takes is another person, unknown and silent, and the knowledge that help is far away. I was 27 when this happened, in late September of 2016, during a solo camping trip in eastern France. I had taken a week off work and decided to spend a few days hiking and camping near the Vosges Mountains, close to the German border. It was the kind of area that looked calm on maps and photos. Thick forests, quiet lakes, old logging roads that barely showed up on GPS. I wanted isolation, the kind where you only hear wind and insects and your own breathing. I parked my car near a small gravel turnout beside a forestry road that was barely wide enough for one vehicle. There was no sign, no gate, nothing official. Just tire marks and weeds pushed down by previous cars. I packed my backpack carefully, locked the car, and walked for almost an hour before choosing a place to set up camp. The ground was flat enough, covered in pine needles, with a shallow stream about 30 meters away. The trees were tall and close together, blocking most of the sky. Even during the day, the forest felt dim. I made sure I was far from any trails. I didn't want other campers nearby. I pitched my tent slowly, checking the ground for rocks, then laid out my sleeping bag and gear. Everything felt normal. The air smelled wet and earthy, and the only sounds were birds and distant wind moving through the trees. I cooked a simple meal on a small stove and cleaned everything carefully, sealing food in bags and hanging it away from the tent. I had camped alone many times before, and I trusted my routine. As the sun started to drop, the forest changed. The light thinned out fast, turning everything gray and then dark blue. The temperature dropped more than I expected. I put on extra layers and sat quietly for a while, just listening. That was when I noticed something that didn't fit. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination or maybe a deer. The steps were slow and uneven, stopping and starting. I stayed still and listened harder. The sound wasn't coming from the trail because there was no trail near me. It sounded like someone moving carefully through the undergrowth, stepping around branches instead of through them. I told myself it was probably another hiker who got off path. Still, my body reacted before my brain could calm down. My heart picked up speed, and my hands felt tight and cold. I stayed quiet, barely breathing, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing me. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I waited. Seconds stretched out into minutes. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then I saw movement between the trees. A man stepped into a thin gap in the brush about 20 meters away. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that blended into the forest. His jacket looked old and worn, the kind that had been used for years. His hair was messy and dark, hanging down around his face. I couldn't see his eyes clearly because of the low light, but I could tell he was looking directly at my campsite. He didn't say anything. He didn't wave or cough or make any sign that he wanted to be seen. He just stood there, completely still, watching. I stayed frozen. Every instinct told me not to move. My tent was visible, and the faint glow from my headlamp inside made it obvious someone was there. The man took a slow step forward, then another, carefully placing his feet. He stopped again, tilting his head slightly, as if listening for something. I realized then that he must have seen the car earlier or followed signs of someone moving through the forest. This place wasn't marked as a campground, and no one should have been wandering this deep unless they were looking for something or someone. After a long moment, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't relax. I stayed still for a long time, listening for any sound. My mind raced through every bad possibility. I considered packing up and leaving right then, but it was already dark, and hiking back through unfamiliar forest at night felt just as dangerous. I turned off my headlamp and sat in total darkness inside the tent. The forest sounds returned slowly, but every small noise felt sharp and threatening. Leaves brushing together sounded like footsteps. A branch snapping made my stomach drop. About an hour later, I heard movement again. This time it was closer. The steps circled the campsite slowly, staying just outside the ring of darkness where I could barely make out shapes. I could hear breathing now. Slow, steady breathing that didn't match the rhythm of someone hiking. It sounded like someone standing still for long periods, then moving again. I held my breath, afraid even the sound of fabric shifting would give me away. The man never entered the campsite fully. He stayed just beyond the edge, moving around, stopping, starting. At one point, I saw his shape again between two trees. He was closer now, maybe 10 meters away. He crouched down. That was the moment fear turned into something sharper and clearer. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't someone lost. This was someone watching and thinking. I reached slowly for my phone, keeping it close to the ground to avoid light. There was barely any signal, but enough to load a map. The route back to the car looked simple enough, but moving in the dark would be loud and risky. The man shifted again. I heard leaves compress under his weight. I imagined him moving closer, reaching out, touching the tent. My body felt numb, like it wasn't fully mine anymore. Then, suddenly, he stood up and moved away. The steps grew faster, heading deeper into the forest, not toward the road. I waited, counting minutes in my head. 5, 10, 15. No sound. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until the first light filtered through the trees. As soon as I could see clearly, I packed everything as fast and quietly as possible. I didn't eat. I didn't check the stream. I just packed and left. On my way back, I noticed things I hadn't seen before. Fresh footprints in soft ground near my campsite that weren't mine. Broken branches placed in strange ways, not snapped by animals but bent and laid down. Near the path back to the car, I found a small pile of trash hidden under leaves. Old food wrappers, empty bottles, and a torn piece of fabric that looked like it came from a jacket similar to the one the man wore. When I reached the car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. I drove straight to the nearest town without stopping. Later that day, I reported the encounter to local authorities. They listened and took notes, but there was no urgency in their response. The area was large and people lived off-grid in the forest sometimes. Nothing illegal had technically happened. That answer stayed with me. What scared me wasn't that I saw a strange man in the woods. It was how comfortable he was there, how quietly he moved, how patiently he watched. He knew the forest better than I did, and he knew I was alone. I never camped alone in remote areas again after that trip. Even now, years later, I still think about the way he stood there in the dim light, not saying a word, not rushing, just waiting. The forest didn't feel wild that night, felt owned, and I realized too late that I was the one who didn't belong there. I was 26 when this happened, sometime in late September of 2018. I had just moved west for work and didn't know many people yet. Camping had always been my way to clear my head, and that fall I decided to do a solo trip to a remote stretch of high desert and pine forest near the Four Corners area. Not a popular campground, no bathrooms, no marked sites, just a wide dirt road that branched off into smaller trails and disappeared into nothing. That was what I wanted. Quiet, space, no people. I drove out before sunrise and reached the area by late morning. The land felt empty in a way that wasn't peaceful, more like abandoned. Dry soil, scattered rocks, juniper trees twisted by wind, and tall pines higher up the slope. I picked a flat spot a good distance from the road and set up my tent facing a small clearing. I made sure I was far enough from any obvious trail. I remember thinking it felt exposed, but I brushed it off as nerves from being alone. The first day went normal. I hiked a few miles, took photos, cooked a basic meal, and watched the sun drop behind the hills. The air got cold fast, too cold for how calm it was. No wind, no bugs, no distant traffic. Just silence so heavy it felt like pressure in my ears. That night I slept lightly but nothing happened. No strange sounds, no footsteps, just the occasional animal moving through brush. The second day is when things shifted. I woke up early and noticed something small but off. Around my campsite, the dirt looked disturbed in places. Not clear footprints, more like scuffs, as if something had paced around without shoes. I told myself it was probably a deer or coyote. Still, I felt watched. That tight feeling in your chest that doesn't come from thinking, just from instinct. I spent most of the day exploring further uphill. The forest there was thicker, darker. I found old fire pits, rusted cans, signs people had been there years ago. I also found something that made me uneasy. Strips of animal hide nailed to a tree, dried and cracked by the sun. No head, no bones nearby, just skin. It didn't look recent, but it didn't look ancient either. I didn't touch it. I left. On my way back to camp, I heard something following me. Slow footsteps that stopped when I stopped. I never saw anything. Every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees and shadow. I told myself I was being paranoid and kept walking, but my pace picked up without me deciding to. By late afternoon, the sky turned gray. Thick clouds rolled in faster than expected. I decided to stay another night instead of packing in a rush. That decision still bothers me. I cooked early and sat by a small fire, trying to calm down. As it got darker, the forest seemed to close in. The sounds changed. No birds, no insects, just occasional movement deeper in the trees. Then I heard it. At first it sounded like an animal trying to make a human noise. A low, rough version of a voice, stretched and wrong. Not words, more like the shape of speech without meaning. Came from far away, then closer, then far again. Like whatever was making it was circling. I stayed still and kept my eyes on the fire. I didn't respond. I didn't move. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was worse. My fire popped once, loud in the still air. That's when I noticed the smell. Rot and wet fur mixed with something metallic. Blood, maybe. It drifted in and out, not constant. Later that night, after I crawled into my tent, I heard footsteps clearly. Slow and heavy. Too slow to be an animal moving naturally. They stopped right outside my tent. I could see a shadow through the fabric, tall and narrow. It leaned close enough that the tent wall pulled inward slightly, like something brushing against it. I held my breath. My heart felt like it was shaking my whole body. The shadow stayed there for a long time. Then it moved away, dragging its feet. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited for daylight. In the early hours before sunrise, I heard it again, farther away. This time it sounded like someone crying. Not loud, not dramatic. Just soft, broken sobbing that rose and fell in a strange rhythm. No words, no clear breath patterns. Felt rehearsed, like an imitation. I knew about stories people told in that region. Skinwalkers, people who wore animal skins and copied sounds. I had never believed in any of it, but laying there in the dark, listening to something fake cry in the woods, the stories wouldn't leave my head. When the sun finally came up, I packed as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up properly. I just shoved things into my pack and loaded the car. That's when I saw the tracks clearly in the morning light. Bare human footprints around my camp. Long toes, deep heels. Some prints overlapped like pacing. They led into the trees, then disappeared on rock. Before leaving, I checked my car. There was a smear of something dark on the driver's side door, dried and flaky. It looked like old blood mixed with dirt. I didn't touch it. I drove out fast, heart racing, eyes glued to the road. About 10 minutes from the main highway, I passed a man standing on the side of the dirt road. He was tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked a size too big. He wasn't hitchhiking, just standing there, facing away. As I passed him, he turned his head slowly. His face looked wrong. Not deformed, just empty, flat expression. Eyes too focused, like he was studying me, not seeing me. I didn't stop. When I got back to town, I went straight to a car wash and scrubbed my vehicle. I stayed in a motel that night, lights on, door locked. I barely slept. The next day, out of curiosity and fear, I did some research. I found reports of missing hikers in that general area. Nothing confirmed, nothing dramatic. Just people who went in and never came out. I also found older stories from locals. Not supernatural explanations, but warnings about a man or men who lived off-grid for years, hunting animals, wearing their hides, mimicking sounds to scare people away or draw them in. People who had lost touch with normal behavior. People who learned how to move quietly, watch patiently, and use fear as a tool. That explanation made more sense than anything else, and somehow it was worse. A person choosing to live like that, choosing to become something that didn't act human anymore. I never went back to that area. I still camp, but never alone and never in places that feel too empty. Sometimes at night, when the world goes quiet, I remember that crying sound and how wrong it felt. Not because it was supernatural, but because it wasn't. It was someone real, close enough to touch my tent, close enough to watch me breathe, choosing not to be seen. That's what still scares me. I went camping alone in the fall of 2016, somewhere in the northern part of Idaho, not far from a stretch of national forest that didn't get much traffic anymore. I was 26 at the time, working a warehouse job that had burned me out badly. I wanted quiet and distance from people, and I wanted it cheap. I found an old Forest Service road on a paper map, one that didn't even show campsites anymore, just a thin gray line disappearing into trees. That was enough for me. I drove my old pickup for hours after leaving the nearest town. Cell service died early, and the road slowly turned from gravel to dirt, then to something closer to packed mud with stones pressed into it. Trees crowded in close on both sides, tall pines mixed with dead ones that leaned at odd angles. The sky was low and gray, not storming, just heavy. I remember thinking it felt like the day was already tired. I finally pulled off where the road widened just enough to park. There was no sign, no fire ring, no trash, nothing that showed anyone had been there recently. The forest floor was thick with needles and damp leaves. The air smelled like wet wood and cold dirt. I liked that feeling at first. Felt clean and honest. I set up my tent a short walk from the truck, close enough that I could still see it through the trees. The ground sloped slightly downward toward a shallow ravine that I assumed carried water during spring melt. It was dry now, filled with rocks and fallen branches. Everything felt quiet in a deep way, like sound had weight and didn't want to move. As the light faded, I cooked a simple meal on my small stove. I ate standing up, watching the tree line, not because I was scared yet, but because being alone that far out makes you more aware of your surroundings. Every little noise stands out. A bird shifting, wind brushing the tops of branches, something small moving through leaves. When it got dark fast. No moon that night, just cloud cover. My headlamp lit up narrow tunnels of space and nothing beyond them. I cleaned up, locked my food in a hard container, and slid it under the truck. I knew enough about animals to not be careless. I crawled into my tent around 9. The temperature dropped quickly. I could feel the cold through the ground even with a pad beneath me. The forest sounded different at night. Not louder, just more focused. Sounds didn't blend together anymore. Each one felt separate and sharp. At some point, I realized I could hear footsteps. Not the light, fast kind from deer or smaller animals, but slow and uneven, like weight shifting carefully. It wasn't constant. A few steps, then nothing, then a few more. I lay still, listening, telling myself it was probably an elk or maybe a bear moving cautiously. That explanation fit well enough that I let myself relax a little. The steps stopped somewhere uphill from my tent, closer to where my truck was parked. I waited, counting my breaths, listening for more. Nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into shallow sleep. I woke up later with no clear reason why. My headlamp was off, and the darkness felt thicker than before. The forest was silent in a way that felt wrong. No insects, no wind. I lay there, eyes open, trying to listen. Then I smelled something that didn't belong. It was faint but clear. Cigarette smoke. It took a few seconds for that to fully sink in. I didn't smoke. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. The smell came and went, like someone exhaling slowly. My heart started to beat harder. and I felt that cold tightening in my chest that comes when logic stops helping. I stayed still. I didn't reach for my headlamp. I didn't unzip the tent. I just listened. There was movement again, closer this time. Slow steps pressing into the ground, careful but not light. Whoever or whatever it was didn't sound lost. It sounded like it knew exactly where it was going. The steps circled wide around my tent, never too close, but close enough that I could hear the ground shift under weight. The smell of smoke came back, stronger now, mixed with something sour and unwashed. I held my breath without meaning to, afraid even that small sound would give me away. After a long time, the steps moved away, back toward the truck. I heard the faint metallic click of something touching metal. The sound was soft but clear in the quiet. It made my stomach drop. I stayed in the tent until the cold started to hurt. My mind kept replaying that sound. I knew then that this wasn't an animal. Animals don't smell like cigarettes. Animals don't touch trucks. Eventually, faint light crept into the tent as morning came. I didn't sleep anymore after that. When I finally unzipped the tent, the forest looked normal again, almost peaceful. Birds were back. The air was clean. I walked slowly toward my truck. The ground near it was scuffed up, boot prints pressed into the damp dirt. They were large, worn down at the heel, and not recent enough to still be crisp, but recent enough to scare me. The hard container with my food had been moved. Not opened, just dragged a few feet away and left on its side. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. But someone had been there, close enough to touch my things, close enough to watch. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't sit. I broke camp with shaking hands, folding things wrong, stuffing gear wherever it fit. The whole time, I felt exposed, like eyes were on me from somewhere I couldn't see. As I drove back down the road, I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. About a mile from where I had camped, there was an old side trail barely visible through the trees. It wasn't on my map. The ground around it was packed hard, like it had been used often. The thought stayed with me the whole drive home. Someone knew that area well. Someone comfortable enough to walk around in the dark, to move quietly, to approach a stranger's camp without fear. I never went back. I didn't report it because there wasn't much to report. No crime, no proof, just a feeling and some footprints that were probably washed away by the next rain. But that night changed how I think about being alone in the woods. It wasn't about monsters or stories or anything unreal. It was about another person, out there for reasons I'll never know, close enough to smell, close enough to touch, choosing not to be seen. That thought has stayed with me for years, heavier than any ghost story. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never that far from places where help is possible. Some places are empty for a reason, and sometimes the scariest thing out there is someone who knows exactly where they are and doesn't want to be found. I went hunting alone in the fall of 2014, the year I thought I finally had my life together. I was 27 and working a boring warehouse job that paid just enough to keep me tired and quiet. I needed space, real space, the kind you only get when the nearest town is miles away and your phone has no signal. I chose a stretch of public land deep in northern Idaho, far from the popular spots. It was thick forest, old logging roads, steep hills, and long valleys where sound carried in strange ways. I parked my truck at the end of a washed-out road and loaded my pack. I carried a rifle, a small tent, food for 3 days, water tablets, a headlamp, and a paper map. The air smelled like wet dirt and pine sap. It was cold but not freezing, the kind of cold that sits in your bones if you stay still too long. I locked the truck and started walking before sunrise, boots crunching on frost and dead leaves. The first few hours were quiet in a way that felt good. No engines, no voices, no fones buzzing. just wind in the trees and the distant sound of birds waking up. I moved slow, watching the ground for tracks and signs. I saw deer prints, old and fresh, and a few places where the brush had been pushed aside recently. Everything felt normal. The forest felt big but not threatening. I set up camp by mid-morning near a small creek. The water was clear and cold, and the ground nearby was flat enough for my tent. I chose the spot because it was hidden from the main trail and had good cover. I hung my food, marked the area on my map, and headed out to scout before the light started to fade. That was when I noticed the first thing that felt off. About a mile from camp, I found boot prints, not old ones. The edges were sharp, pressed deep into the soft ground near the creek bank. They were not hunting boots like mine. The tread was different, more like work boots. I stopped and looked around, listening. I told myself it was probably another hunter or a ranger. The land was public. People were allowed to be there. Still, I hadn't seen a single vehicle on the way in, and this spot was far enough out that most people wouldn't bother. I followed the prints for a short distance. Then they disappeared into rock and brush. I let it go and kept moving. As the day went on, the forest grew quieter than it should have been. Birds stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to die down. Every sound I made felt loud, like it didn't belong. I kept checking behind me without meaning to. That feeling stayed with me until the sun started dropping behind the trees. On my way back to camp, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A branch near my camp had been snapped clean in half, fresh sap still wet at the break. I knew it hadn't been like that earlier. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees, rifle held tight against my chest. I didn't see anything move. I didn't hear footsteps, just my own breathing and the creek running behind me. I told myself animals break branches all the time. Elk, deer, even bears. I forced myself to finish setting up camp. I cooked a simple meal and cleaned everything carefully. As it got dark, the temperature dropped fast. The forest smelled damp and cold, and the shadows between the trees felt deeper than before. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up to small sounds. Leaves shifting, a soft crunch that could have been a squirrel or could have been something else. At one point, I smelled cigarette smoke. It was faint, but it was there. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I don't smoke, and the smell was sharp and real. It faded after a few minutes, but the damage was done. Someone else was out there. I didn't hear voices. I didn't see a flashlight, just the knowledge that I was not alone. When morning came, I packed quickly. I decided to hunt farther out and avoid camp as much as possible. I followed a ridge line that overlooked a wide valley. The view was good, and the ground was littered with old tracks. I moved slow, careful with every step. Around noon, I found a crude structure made of branches and tarp tucked into a shallow dip in the land. It wasn't a hunter's blind. It was too enclosed, too hidden. Inside, there were empty food cans, old clothes, and a dirty sleeping bag. Someone had been living out there. Not camping, living. My heart started pounding hard. I backed away without touching anything. As I turned, I saw movement uphill from me, just a shape slipping behind a tree. I froze, watching. Nothing else moved. No sound followed. Whoever it was knew how to stay quiet. From that moment on, the forest felt hostile. Every tree looked like cover for someone watching. Every shadow felt heavy. I didn't run. I knew better than that. I moved steady but fast, changing direction often, trying to loop back toward camp without being obvious. I found fresh footprints again, this time overlapping my own from earlier that morning. That's when fear really set in. Someone had followed me, step for step, close enough to place their boots where mine had been. That was not a coincidence. That was intent. I cut off the trail and pushed through thick brush, scratching my arms and face. I crossed the creek twice to confuse any tracks. My lungs burned, and sweat soaked my clothes despite the cold. I kept listening for pursuit, but all I heard was my own movement. When I finally reached camp, my tent was disturbed. The zipper was open. My pack had been moved. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong, like a warning. I didn't hesitate. I broke camp in minutes, stuffing gear wherever it fit. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I cared about leaving. As I started the long hike back to the truck, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, keeping distance. I never saw the person, but I knew they were there. The sound would stop when I stopped and start again when I moved. It went on for nearly an hour. I kept my rifle ready and my eyes forward. I didn't turn around. I didn't shout. I focused on putting ground between me and whoever was back there. The forest thinned as I got closer to the road, and light broke through the trees. When I finally reached the truck, relief hit me so hard my hands shook. The passenger door had a muddy handprint on it. That was the final proof. Someone had been waiting, watching, close enough to touch my vehicle. I got in and drove without stopping, tires throwing dirt and gravel behind me. I didn't slow down until I reached pavement. I didn't look back. Later, I reported what I found to the local ranger station. I showed them photos I had taken of the shelter and the prints. They told me there were known transients in the area, people who stayed off the grid and didn't want to be found. They said it wasn't the first report like mine. I never went back to that place. I still hunt, but I don't go alone anymore, and I don't ignore the small signs. What scared me wasn't an animal or some made-up monster. It was the quiet patience of another human being, watching, waiting, choosing when to be seen. That kind of fear stays with you long after the forest fades in your rearview mirror. I was 27 when this happened, sometime in late October of 2016. I had been camping on and off since my teens, and I liked going alone because it felt quiet in a way cities never were. That year had been rough for me, and I wanted a few days without phones, without people, without noise. I picked a stretch of public land near a long, shallow river in the northern part of the state. It was not a park with signs and bathrooms. It was just woods, old logging roads, and open ground where people were allowed to camp if they kept it clean. The weather had been cold but dry for days, which made the ground hard and the air sharp. The trees were mostly bare, and the forest felt wide open, like nothing could hide for long. That made me feel safer than summer camping, when everything is thick and dark. I parked my truck near a broken gate and walked in with my pack for about an hour, following an old dirt road that had turned into two muddy lines with grass in the middle. I chose a spot on a small rise above the river so I would not wake up wet if it rained. I set up my tent, collected dead wood, and cooked a simple meal before dark. Everything felt normal. The wind moved through the trees in a steady way, and the river made a low, constant sound. I remember feeling calm and tired, the good kind of tired that comes from walking all day. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. I put on another layer, cleaned up, and put my food into a sealed container away from my tent. I had camped like this many times before. When night came, it was darker than I expected. There was no moon, and clouds covered the stars. My headlamp made a small bubble of light that felt weak against the black woods. I turned it off and sat in the dark for a while, listening. The forest had sounds, but nothing strange. Just water, wind, and the occasional movement of small animals. After a while, I went into my tent and lay down, fully dressed inside my sleeping bag. Sleep did not come easily. The cold pressed through the ground, and my mind kept drifting. At some point, I noticed something that pulled me fully awake. The river sound seemed different, like it was being blocked or changed. It took me a moment to realize it was not the river at all. It was footsteps on wet leaves. Slow and careful, not heavy like a deer running, and not light like a squirrel. They stopped, then started again. I stayed still, listening. I told myself it was another camper who had wandered off trail. That made sense, but it did not match how quiet the steps were. Whoever it was moved like they were trying not to be heard. The steps circled wide, staying just at the edge of where I could sense them. I never heard breathing or coughing, just the careful pressure of boots on the ground. I did not turn on my light right away. I did not want to give away my position. My heart was beating hard enough that I could feel it in my neck. After a long minute, the steps moved farther away. I waited longer, counting my breaths, then finally turned on my headlamp and looked through the thin wall of the tent. The light did nothing but bounce back at me. Outside was still black. I told myself I was being paranoid. Alone in the woods, every sound feels closer and bigger. I turned the light off again and tried to sleep. That was when I smelled smoke. Not the clean smell of a campfire, but something sour and oily, like burning trash or damp wood. It drifted through the tent in slow waves. I sat up. I had fully put out my fire hours earlier. I always drowned it and stirred it until it was cold. The smell was coming from uphill, away from the river. I unzipped the tent slowly and looked out. Far through the trees, I could see a faint orange flicker. It was low to the ground and moved like it was being fed small pieces at a time. Someone else had made a fire, close enough that I could smell it, but far enough that I could not see who it was. There had been no sign of another camp during the day. No tire tracks, no cleared spots, nothing. This fire had not been there earlier. I closed the tent and sat there, thinking. The smart thing would have been to pack up and leave right then, but it was the middle of the night, and walking out in total darkness felt dangerous too. I decided to stay alert until morning. I kept my boots on and my knife within reach. I did not sleep. The fire smell faded after a while. The steps came back once more, closer this time. They stopped just outside the circle where my tent would have been visible in daylight. The ground shifted slightly, like someone had crouched down. I could feel that someone was there, even though I could not see or hear them clearly. The silence felt heavy, like pressure on my ears. Then there was a soft sound, almost like fabric brushing against fabric. After that, nothing. The steps moved away again, slow and careful, heading back uphill toward where I had seen the fire. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. When morning finally came, it felt like I had survived something instead of just waking up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The forest looked normal in daylight, almost peaceful. But the ground around my camp told a different story. There were boot prints in the damp soil, circling my tent at a distance of maybe 20 feet. They were not hiking boots like mine. The tread was flatter, more worn. The prints went uphill and stopped near a patch of blackened ground where a small fire had been. There were no cans, no food wrappers, nothing left behind. Whoever had been there had cleaned up carefully. Closer to my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My food container, which I had hung from a tree, was gone. The rope was still there, cleanly cut. It had not snapped. It had been sliced. I did not waste time after that. I packed as fast as I could, hands shaking, checking the woods every few seconds. I kept expecting someone to step out from behind a tree, but no one did. When I reached the old dirt road, I felt exposed and relieved at the same time. The walk back to my truck felt longer than it had the day before. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local ranger office, even though I knew nothing would come of it. There was no crime, no proof, just my word and some boot prints that would be gone after the next rain. They told me people sometimes camp illegally out there and leave when they hear someone else nearby. That explanation did not fit the careful movement, the cut rope, or the way that fire had been hidden. For weeks after, I replayed the night in my head. I thought about how close that person had been, how long they might have watched me before I noticed anything was wrong. I realized that the scariest part was not that something happened, but that nothing did. Whoever it was had the chance to do more and chose not to, or was waiting for a different moment that never came. I still camp sometimes, but never like that again. I do not go alone, and I do not choose places that are too quiet or too empty. The woods did nothing wrong that night. It was just trees and water and cold air. What scared me was knowing that someone else was out there, close enough to touch my tent, and quiet enough to leave without a trace, as if they had never been there at all. I was 26 when this happened, back in late October of 2014. I remember the year clearly because it was right after I quit my warehouse job and decided to take a few weeks to clear my head. I drove north into a quiet farming area outside a small town in western Iowa. It was flat land, long gravel roads, old barns leaning slightly from decades of wind, and fields that stretched so far they made you feel small. I had grown up around farms, so nothing about the place felt strange at first. It felt familiar, slow, and empty in a way I liked. I planned to camp for 2 nights on a piece of land I believed was unused. There was no fence at the entrance, no posted signs that I could see from the road, and the farmhouse nearby looked abandoned. The windows were dark, some broken, and weeds were growing up through the porch steps. The barn behind it was large and old, the kind built when farmers expected to pass land down for generations. The paint had peeled to bare wood, and the metal roof was rusted and bowed in places. I parked my truck near a tree line and walked the rest of the way in, carrying my pack and tent to a spot near the edge of a harvested cornfield. The air smelled like damp soil and dead leaves. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, and my boots left deep prints. I set up camp before sunset, making sure my tent was tucked between a small rise and a cluster of trees so the wind wouldn't hit it directly. I kept things simple. No fire, no loud music, nothing that would draw attention. I ate cold food and watched the sky turn orange and then gray. As darkness settled, the farm became quiet in a way that felt heavy, not peaceful, just empty. That night, I noticed sounds I didn't expect. Not animals, at least not the usual kind. There were long pauses between noises, like something was moving and then stopping, listening. I heard the crunch of gravel near the barn long after dark. It wasn't steady like wind or random like a raccoon. It sounded deliberate, slow, and careful. I stayed still inside my tent, telling myself it was probably a deer or a stray dog. Farms attract all kinds of animals, especially when harvest season leaves food behind. I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind brushed the tent fabric, my body tensed. At one point, I smelled something sharp and sour, like sweat mixed with metal. It faded after a while, and eventually exhaustion took over. Morning brought fog so thick I could barely see the barn from my campsite. Everything was wet, my tent soaked, my boots damp. I made coffee on a small stove and walked the edge of the field to stretch my legs. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. They came from the direction of the barn and stopped about 20 yards from where my tent had been. The prints were deep, like someone had been standing there for a long time. I crouched down and looked closer. Work boots, worn soles, uneven tread. Whoever it was hadn't wandered through by accident. I felt exposed after that. The fog made it worse. Sound didn't travel far, and visibility was limited to a few yards in any direction. I packed most of my gear and decided to stay alert for the rest of the day. I told myself I'd leave after one more night, mostly because I didn't want to feel like I was overreacting. That was a mistake. In the afternoon, I explored the barn. The doors were partially open, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Inside, the smell hit me hard. Old hay, oil, rot, and something else I couldn't place. The floor was dirt and scattered boards, with old tools left where they'd been dropped years ago. There were signs someone had been using the space recently. A pile of blankets in one corner, empty food cans, fresh boot prints in the dust. This wasn't an abandoned farm. Someone was living here, or at least staying here. I backed out slowly and returned to my campsite. I moved my tent closer to my truck and kept my keys in my pocket. As the sun went down again, the farm felt different. The silence wasn't just emptiness anymore. It felt watched. I kept scanning the field, the barn, the tree line. My chest stayed tight, my jaw clenched. Just after dark, I heard movement again. This time it was closer. I smelled that sharp, sour scent again, stronger now. I stayed inside my tent, barely breathing. I heard footsteps in the grass, slow and uneven. They circled once, then stopped. The fabric of my tent shifted slightly, like someone brushed against it by accident or on purpose. I felt pressure near my head, then it eased. No words, no sounds of struggle, just the knowledge that someone was right there. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't move until I heard the footsteps retreat toward the barn. When I finally crawled out of the tent, my legs were shaking. I grabbed my pack and walked straight to my truck, not bothering to pack neatly. As I got closer, my flashlight caught something hanging from the driver's side mirror. It was a strip of dirty cloth, torn from a blanket, tied in a loose knot. It hadn't been there earlier. I got in the truck and locked the doors. The engine felt too loud in the quiet night. As I turned the headlights toward the barn, I saw a figure standing near the open doors. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. The person didn't move when the lights hit them. They just stood there watching. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I backed out fast, tires slipping in the mud, heart pounding so hard it made my ears ring. I drove until the gravel turned to pavement and the farm disappeared behind me. I reported the incident the next day. I didn't give many details, just enough to explain why I left in the middle of the night. A few weeks later, I heard through a local paper that the property owner had discovered someone squatting in the barn. The person had been living there for months, avoiding town, stealing supplies from nearby farms. No mention of violence, but enough to confirm I hadn't imagined it. I don't camp on farms anymore. I still camp, but only in places with clear boundaries and other people nearby. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I still remember that smell and the way the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The scariest part wasn't the person themselves. It was realizing how easy it was to be watched without knowing, and how close I came to staying just one night too long.